he would always say, we were so poor, he said there were 3 of us brothers in bed, and then my older brother got married, then there were 4 of us.
No.
So, you want a few more of these? My dad would say, he said, I never knew there was more to a chicken besides the neck until I was 18 and got my own, lived on my own. Being desperately poor can definitely left a mark on my father. It really did. And so when he escaped from his country and immigrated to the United States, he made himself a promise that he would make sure his kids went to college and they always had a house to live in and food on the table. That was his purpose in life, to make sure that his family had it better than he did. And I don't think they would bring any shame to my father, but the last memory that he has of his dad, my grandfather, was his grandfather was inebriated, and the night before my father fled his country, my grandfather went into his room and stole his only new set of clothes that my dad had bought for the trip. And that was the last memory of my dad with his dad. Never saw him again after that. Being desperately poor can leave a mark on you. And if for some reason the grace of God, and I don't know why, I don't know, but why my dad was led in that direction and why my grandfather was led in the other direction, I don't understand, and I don't think I ever will. But he kept his promise. And my dad not only was very generous towards his family, but he was very generous towards his church and to missionaries. I asked my dad one time, I said, Dad, this was after we had become missionaries. I said, Dad, if you had to sum up the secret of life, of being a happy man, he said, what would it be? And he would say, well, he said, for me, it was only 2 things. He said, pay your tithes and be faithful to your wife. He said, just do those 2 things, and somehow everything will fall into order. And I was already a father of 3 children at that point. I thought, man, that's awful simple. And the older I get, the more profound that I realize that it is, that when you put God first and then your wife, for a man, things are going to line up in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, we have a story this afternoon found in a Japanese ad came up on my phone, and now I can't access the text. What in the world? There we go. It's gone. We have a story in 2 Kings chapter 4, and I wish I had the time to read the whole thing to you. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of the first part, and that is that there was this general who was a very successful warrior for Syria and the king of Aram, and he was very successful, and he also had a very good reputation of being an honorable person. His biggest problem, though, in life was that he was a leper. And he lived with this disease and was still managed to be a successful general or commander of his king's forces. And one day on a mission, they somehow get into Israel and they capture a village and they capture people and they take them back. And one of those people is a young girl who becomes the servant to his wife. And this young servant girl, obviously filled with the grace of God, sees that the man of the house was a leper. And one day she says, if he ever has a chance, he ought to go back to where I come from, because there's a prophet there named, and who can heal him of that disease. And Naaman, general, immediately takes that and goes to his boss, the king, and tells him, she said, and the king says, you know what, I'll write a letter of introduction. And not only that, take a ton of gold and silver with you and 10 sets of clothing and present yourself. And he sends the letter off, and they go back to the land where this girl comes from and present it to the king. And the king thinks it's some sort of a military tactic and kind of loses it. But Elisha the prophet hears about it and says, well, isn't there a prophet in your land? Hello? He says, send Naaman to me. And so Naaman shows up with all of his entourage at Elisha's house. And Elisha gives them the most simple instructions. We're back to Japanese. And he says to him, tell Naaman to just go down to the river Jordan and to bathe in it and dip 7 times and he'll be fine. And this man, who normally is an honorable man, a respectful man, a man of self-control, loses his temper. Doesn't tell us why, but what's the change? And he says, that's ridiculous. And he's ready to march out of the country and forget the whole deal. And his servants, who have better sense than he does at that moment, say to him, look, if he would have asked you to do something earth-changing, you would have done it, right? All he's saying is go down to the river, dip 7 times, and we'll all go home. A lot happier than when... So he does it. And the 7th time he comes out of the river, and he's totally clean. And the Message Bible says he's like, he has skin of a little baby. So Naaman goes back to Elisha to thank him, and he says, and I want to reward you for what you've just done, and I've got just all this tons of gold and silver and all these clothes, and I want to give to you. And Elisha says, I don't want a single thing from you. Now, Elisha could have taken all of that loot, and he could have put it to good use. He could have given it to the Shunammite woman, her and her son were living off the oil that he had produced, but it wasn't going to last forever. Or he could have given all of that gold and silver and the clothes to the sons of the prophets who all lived by faith. He could have passed it out because it was a time of famine and there were a lot of needy people. But Elisha said, I don't want anything, because I don't want you in any way to think it was I who did it for you. And that sort of humility by Elijah immediately humbles Naaman, and he says, well, if you don't take anything from me, can I take something from you? He says, can I put dirt from this holy ground into some burlap sacks and put them on my donkeys? And I want to go back and I'm going to build an altar where I live, and I'm never, ever going to worship foreign gods again. Wow. Yeah. Because of Elisha's self-control and humility, this man was won. And so he allows him to take it, because back then they believed that the God that you worship was tied to the land that you lived in. So that if you just had some dirt from that land, that God would go with you. That's what they believed at that time. And believe it or not, that's still a common belief. And so he turns around and leaves with the dirt, but all of the gold and silver and clothes that he came with. But then there's a twist in this whole thing. And the twist is that Elisha had a faithful servant named Gehazi. And Gehazi accompanied him on a lot of these miracles. And he was constantly there next to Elisha, serving him and taking, in the ministry there. But for some reason, and it doesn't tell us why, in verse 20 it says, when Gehazi, Elisha's servant, the holy man, said to himself, my master has let this man slip through his fingers without so much as a thank you. By the living God, I'm going after him to get something or other from him. And Gehazi took off after Naaman. And when Naaman saw him running after him, he jumped down from his chariot to greet him and he said, is something wrong? And Gehazi the servant, Elisha's servant, says, no, nothing's wrong, but something's come up. My master sent me to tell you, which was a lie, that 2 young men just showed up from the hill country of Ephraim, brothers from the guild of the prophets, the sons of the prophets. We talked about this yesterday. And they have a lot of needs. Could you supply their needs with a gift, let's say, of 75 pounds of silver and a couple sets of clothes? And Naaman, being totally unaware that this is all just a ruse, says, of course. But how about I give you double? I'll give you 150 pounds of silver. And Naaman insisted, so he tied up the money in 2 sacks and gave him the 2 sets of clothes. He even gave Gehazi the servant 2 extra servants to carry all of that silver back to town. And when they got to the outskirts, right on the edge of the hill, Gehazi took the 150 pounds of silver, dismissed the servants. Okay, you can leave now. Hid them, stored them inside someplace, and then he went back and stood before his master Elisha. And Elisha says, so what have you been up to, Gehazi? And Gehazi says, according to the Message Bible, nothing much. And Elisha says, didn't you know I was with you in spirit when that man stepped down from his chariot to greet you? Tell me this. Is this a time to look after yourself, lining your pockets with gifts? Naaman's skin disease will now infect you and your family with no relief in sight. And Gehazi, his faithful servant of all those years, walked away, his skin flaky and white, leprous like snow. End of the chapter. What a parallel. That the man who didn't know God before was completely healed and became a God worshiper from that day on. And the prophet's servant who had known God for a long time became covetousness and suffered the rest of his life from leprosy. Now this story, I always, when I speak from the Old Testament, I always like to say, this is a true story with real people who really lived. This is a true story with real people. And this is a parallel picture of covetousness versus contentment. And covetousness is a state of mind in which a person is never at peace in their circumstances nor with what they have. Never at peace in their circumstances or with what they have. While contentment is a mindset that is at peace in their circumstances and with what they have. Elisha could have put this reward to good use. But he knew that this was not the time to take all of this silver and gold and all these clothes, no matter how much good he could do with it. Somehow he recognized this would be a poor decision and probably become a temptation. Because he and Gehazi and the sons of the prophets had all lived by faith up to this point. And here's an opportunity to not have to live by faith. He knew that it would be a temptation and an interruption. And you know what? Gehazi himself knew that this was not a good decision. Because he did it all under secret and under was a lie. Oh, by the way, these guys have arrived and my boss sent me to catch you really quick. Well, he knew that wasn't true. And then as soon as he gets to the edge of town, he takes what it is and he hides it, thinking that Elisha will never find out. And then when he's called on it, he lies again by saying, I've been here the whole time. So he knew that this was a poor decision. My wife and I got a a newsletter from a missionary couple that worked in a strong Muslim area in Africa. And they were on itineration. And a church said to them, we want to adopt you guys, and we're going to raise money so that you can buy a piece of property and build a Christian church and dig a water well. And they, right there in the service, and they expected our missionary friends were like, woo, hoo, hoo, yeah. And our missionary friends said, let us pray about it to see if that's what God wants. And they were, are you kidding us? You know how many missionaries we could have offered this to? And our missionary friend said, we don't make good decisions, we make God decisions. It would have been probably a good decision to accept all that and then distribute it to all of the poor people. But Elisha somehow knew what a God decision was. And that God decision led to that foreign commander becoming a God follower. And because of that decision, to be dishonest, Gehazi, his servant, not only the money didn't serve him, because now he had to live out in isolation. He couldn't come into town and shop. And the clothes would only serve him really one time, because after you put them on, they would be infected. So you see, he gained nothing. Plus, he lost his ministry as being servant to Elisha the prophet. You know, contentment is a great, great gift. You don't earn contentment. There's no way. That's why the Apostle Paul says in Philippians 4:11, I have learned to be content in all things, that it is a gift. It is a gift. It's a gift that I, your Sincere director, have not fully learned. Because most of my complaining and dissatisfaction is because of a lack of contentment in my circumstances and in what I have. In the United States of America, the number one disorder, and we've got a lot of them in the United States, right? You could combine all those alphabet letters into a lot of three-letter disorder IDs. The number one disorder, diagnosed disorder, is anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorder. And it's because of a deep discontentment that produces worry over who I am, what people think of me, and what I have in my circumstances. If nothing else, we as Christians, and I didn't even add AGW and missionaries, but we as Christians, if we can learn to live content in our circumstances, the life change that it would produce and the peace that it would produce in just our hearts alone would be life-changing. And you know what? I share this story with you today because I think it's good for all of us, but it might be for one or two of us specifically that's really struggling today with circumstances and with possessions. Some of you left lucrative backgrounds behind. And it sure was nice to look at that checkbook and see how much is in there. That might be the case. That may not be the case. But one of the reasons that I'm so high on Sincere is that it is a place where there are not a whole lot of outside influences asking much of us right now. This is a place where pretty much your focus is learning the language. I know the Gordons are the exception. You guys are always the exception. You guys are special. And the ones are heading in that direction too, is living here permanently. But you know, contentment, that sense of I'm okay with my circumstances and what I have. What a great gift. What a great gift. I think we can really benefit from all that. Father, I thank you for these very precious people in front of me who have a whole lifetime of service ahead of them.